Learn to write Thursday in calligraphy, starting with brush pen calligraphy. Everywhere that these colors alternate is a new stroke where I'm going to lift up my pen. Thursday has a couple of unique features to it. The T and H combination at the beginning can be a little tricky because sometimes they could run into each other. Like if you were to just do a T and then you have your H, it can be a little bit tricky to get that spacing right. So here's one solution you could do where we have the crossbar of the T is going to be pretty high up, and make sure you don't end it too far to the right. And then we're going to start the H with a little bit of entrance element like this to kind of fill in some of the space here, but also make sure that your loop isn't too close to that capital T. And then we'll keep going with our normal calligraphy letters, which have a thick downstroke and a thin upstroke. This word has some of my favorite letters. I love writing R and S. There are lots of different ways that you can write both of those letters. And here are just some modern calligraphy options. In our letter logic course, we show you how you can change that up. For example, you could make the R have an open loop like this instead of that closed loop. And then like same with the S, you could do an open loop on the top, and there's tons of different ways that you could write R and S. Now let's create the same calligraphy look using a regular pen in Faux Calligraphy. So the first step is just going to be writing out the whole word with a regular pen. If you would like, you could do the H first so that you know where your T crossbar needs to end so it doesn't run into the H. This is called monoline script because the letters just have a single mono weight. And actually the pen I'm using is called a mono twin because it has two sides to it, and each one is mono weight. It actually almost feels like a marker. All right, and then the next step to turn it into the calligraphy style is adding our thick downstrokes. Anywhere that you have a downstroke, you can add another line. You may want to wait till this dries before you go back over so you don't smudge it. But we're just going to add a second line next to the downstrokes so that it creates the idea of a thicker line. And then you can choose to leave these open or fill them in at the end to create the calligraphy look. You can also be creative with it. If you're using this for a journal or something, you could color these gaps in with a different color or patterns, whatever you want to do. Now I'll show you another way you can hand letter Thursday using a brush pen. This time, instead of doing a calligraphy script style, I'm going to use the brush pen to write some capital letters. It's the same idea of thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes, changing up the weight. And in some cases, like you'll notice for this R, technically this piece is a downstroke, but if you already have a really thick stem here, then it might feel like too much to add more thickness on this part of the R, so I'm going to choose to leave that thin. For the S, there's actually two different ways you could do the S. I'll show you on the side. So for the S, you could either make your thick stroke here and here, or you could make turn your hand a little bit and make this main like spine of the S be thick. Those are two different options. I usually do it this way. Now let's do bounce lettering. So for Thursday, I'm going to make this crossbar of the T go directly into that H. That's a good combination for adding in a little bit of that playful character of bounce lettering. The H is also a good spot to bring this curve below your baseline. And then I also like to make that top of the R a bit more open of a loop, like this. We could change up the S style, make it look like that. You can also, instead of just making everything have a dip that comes up like that D, you could actually drop the connection for a little bit of a variation. I think that D is a good spot to do that, or like a T. You probably wouldn't want to do it on letters like A because that could kind of look like a Q. And maybe we do something fun with the bottom of the Y. That doesn't look very even to me, so I'm going to try something else. Okay, so I feel like this dip of the D is getting a little bit too much in the way of anything fun that I can do with the Y, so I'm actually going to redo that D and not make it dip down quite as low to give me more room for something to do with the Y. Like that. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Okay, see, now I have more room here and the D isn't going to clash with what I've done for the Y. Okay, so this is one thing one style of bounce lettering that you could do on your iPad or with any pen. Let's write Thursday in Copperplate, and remember for the capital T, we're going to make the stem just a little bit shorter than you would make a normal capital stem. So I'm starting 2.5 spaces above the X height instead of 3. The shade right here on this part is called a secondary shade, so it should be a little bit thinner than the shading on your stem. The width of your shades should be consistent in a word. And you can, if you're using a flexible nib, like how I'm using a Hunt 101 nib right now, I can press a lot harder and get a lot thicker of a line. But the trick is to keep it consistent throughout. Okay, so you noticed when I started this upstroke on the H, my pen skipped a little bit, so I just started over and redid the stroke. There's a little bit of an extra line right there. That's okay. The R and the S both go above the X height. You notice you can see through the hole of the nib now, so I know it's for sure time to dip into the ink. I usually try to dip before I get to that point. We have another D here to practice making our stem touch the right side of the oval. Now I keep missing the A. I keep making the shade not touch the right side of the oval, but you can really only see it if you're looking really close. You'll also notice that I usually pause here before going into the Y. You can pause and lift if you need at the baseline or the header line between letters, just so it's easier to keep going, because if I started here and made this all in one motion, it's just a lot of down, up, down, up. Now, having all these words on the same page that end with Y, I'm trying to make the descending stem loop of the Y also the same height as each other to make it consistent. Another thing I wanted to point out about Thursday, if you flip the descending loop of the Y upside down, it should match the H. Now here I made the H a little bit shorter because if I made it taller, it would run into this part of the T. Now you could purposely make it taller and then have the T cross through it, or you could move this part up a little bit to make it fit. If you were going to have it cross through, I would actually do the stem of the T first, then draw the H, then make it cross through. So I'm doing the stem of the T first, and then I'm going to draw the ascending loop of the H. Make the oval, and then kind of come down lower and cross through the loop of the H. Now let's flourish Thursday with a brush pen. I'm going to give myself space here to add a flourish on my H. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the stem of the T, then I'm going to make my downstroke of my H. I know this doesn't really look like a T or an H quite yet, but it will be. And I'm actually going to go ahead and write a few more letters just so I have more context for my spacing. Again, I kind of planned this out already, so I also know that I'm going to add a flourish off of the R, so I'm going to leave that open to be able to add a flourish instead of connecting it right into the S. I'm just going to do a regular D. Okay, I'm going to get my pencil out for this one. So I have two ideas for how I can flourish the T and the H. The first idea that I had was to make a flourish coming off of the H this way that fills in this area right here, and then just keep like a regular cap on the T. Another way you can do it is connect the T and the H together. So I'm going to do this again in pencil just to plan it out and see how this works, where I go from the T into the H and connect them together. Now I'm liking how this is looking. As long as I have a pencil out, I'm just going to pencil in my other flourishes here. So I'm connecting the T and the H together with this flourish. Then I'm finishing the stem of the T with this spiraling flourish. And then with the R, I'm filling in this space with this figure 8 that kind of spirals outward. And then I'm adding onto the Y loop with a flourish on the end that balances out the flourishes over here. So for a flourish like this, I actually drew it in pencil coming in this direction, but it could go either way. I want the shade to end up right here, so I'm actually going to start here, add a little bit of shade right there. I'm actually not trying to trace it too perfectly, because if I try to trace it too perfectly, it'll end up being not very smooth. So I'm just following the general shape here. Okay, and then I'm going to add this flourish on the stem right here. Now I made a little bit of a mistake and I added shade on this curve, and they're crossing together, which creates a little bit of a dark spot right there. But I didn't add too much, so I think it's okay. Okay, and then on this flourish, again, I'm gonna keep the general concept. I'm gonna try not to follow it too perfectly. It actually ended up following pretty well with the line that I had there. And then we'll finish with the loop on the Y. So I'm making the stem loop of the Y first, and then I'm coming back in with this flourish here. So to make this maybe a little bit more balanced, I'm actually going to continue this curve right here and spiral out a little bit more. Ideally that would be smoother and it would have been done in one motion, but I just decided to add it at the end. Now I'm noticing there's it looks like a little bit of a gap here between the T and the H. Normally an H would have an entrance stroke right here, which in this case is actually not really necessary because the way that it's drawn, the stem is connected. But I think that it would help make that gap look less of a gap, so I'm just going to add it in there. So there's a way to flourish Thursday. Now let's write Thursday in Spencerian. The stem of the T is only 2 spaces tall, so I'm going to use my guide sheets to help me with that and use the dotted slant line to help me keep it right along the slant. And this one's a tricky one because the shade is only in the bottom part and you need to taper into the shade while you're curving, so it's a little bit tricky to get that shape down. I'm going to make sure I have room to keep that ascending loop of the H below the T, so I just made it a tiny bit shorter than I normally would. And again, for the Y, you can add the shade either on the compound curve right here or on the descending loop. Either way is fine. I don't actually love how this stem looks after looking at the whole word. I think it almost looks a little bit too angled, so I'm going to try that one more time. This is not my biggest strength. This shape is not my biggest strength, but I'm okay with how that looks. Thanks for watching our series on how to write the days of the week in calligraphy. Let us know in the comments which style is your favorite, and check out the blog post at lovelyloops.com to see pictures of all of these styles, as well as more helpful tips and free resources. Thanks again, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.